Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Action. It's your weekly guide to navigating the world of business growth. I'm Kristina Witmer, a marketing veteran, and I'm joined by Deborah Horowitz. She is an HR and talent leader. Each week, we bring you some actionable tips and insights specifically for small business owners, marketing directors, head of sales and marketing. And we like to dive into these discussions on these topics to help you grow yourself and your business. Welcome to our special guest this week, Underwood. Now, you're an expert on information security and privacy, cyber operations automations. You're going to have to break that down for me. So I'm looking
Oh,
forward
wow.
to
Yeah.
getting that sort of understood into some actionable tips. So why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll try to scare you with some questions.
Oh, absolutely. All that breaks down to I realized that very early on in my career, IT and a lot of manuals. I feel like engineers always have their pamphlets and their checklists, right?
Mhm.
And back in what early 2000s, late 1990s, like turn of the century, I guess we could say, and make it sound old, right? I realized I was really good at breaking or finding holes in the manual, but wasn't as good at memorizing exactly what's on page 34. And so I realized, that it took me a little bit of time, but I realized that cybersecurity is all about like what the hackers are doing, and they are definitely not in the playbook, right? They're not following the rules. And then I realized also I'm an inventor. And so that also means that you just take the rule book and you say, great, here's 34 pages. What would be on page 35 if I was going to make a new page, right? And so that's kind of shaped my career. And that's why it's like into cybersecurity and hacking. And it's all about using your products in a way that the manufacturer did not intend.
That's very interesting. No, as timely as it was today in my inbox, of course, shows up this phishing email. And they're looking for me to click on a payment that has come over. And I'm like, yeah, I got you
Right.
know. But so many times when people are busy, that's when they're most vulnerable, right? To
Absolutely.
clicking on these links and things.
And you know what? I had an exercise where someone asked me to try to help them with a simulated attack, right? And it was a bank that the employees were very well trained and they wouldn't click on the links. They wouldn't cooperate with the what they call penetration testers. So they asked me, of course, even then I was more expensive than the normal folks. And maybe that's the gray hair. I don't know. So I said, well, let's go ahead and let's see what I can do. And I said, if I get in, you pay me. If I don't, then not. And I was pretty confident. Well, what I did was I looked at the bank and I said, well, there's a whole team of people that whose whole job was to process these loan applications. And so I went ahead and it was actually not a US based bank, but I went ahead and I grabbed one of these loan application PDFs and I said, well, these people are paid to open these things up and read them and assess them. So they're going to click on the link on the attachment. So I put an exploit into there, like something that like piece of malware in there. And then I said, well, let me try emailing this alias for like inbound loan applications. And sure enough, I got 10 people and they were like, "Oh, you tricked them." And I'm like, "No, that's their job. They're working to
Uh,
death trying to open these things. So give me my money." I got in. Uh, I felt bad for them because I'm like that. You're absolutely right, Deb. Like they're very busy. They're rated on how fast they can read and open these things and process them. And I used one of their own documents against them. And it was a setup, where no matter how smart they were, you're sacrificing someone's paycheck at that point by making them not work fast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my first question for you would be what what are the most critical information security risks that small business owners often overlook? And give us some simple steps that we can take to kind of make sure that's top of mind and we know how to address those.
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. You read online, it goes around in circles with a lot of these IT providers and security providers. Sometimes they appear a bit egotistical about, oh, look, the hackers are breaking in with these like very simple things, like making sure you have two-factor turned on and making sure your systems are patched, right? And there's this misconception. I always hated it whenever we see some form of a QVC commercial where like, oh, do these 7 steps and you're hacker proof. And I'm like, that's so dangerous because they are using that. But there's people like me behind the scenes that have a whole host of more advanced capabilities, but there's really no need for them to use them. If the door's unlocked, there's really no need to
Mhm.
bring out I grew up watching it full time with my parents. So like your Binford 9000 lock picker, there's just no need for that because the door's wide open. So I think using multi-factor, where you get that code on your phone or text message can work too, not as good. That kind of stuff is really important. And turning it on everywhere you can, I think can really help to be able to let you be a little bit more protected and it can make life a lot harder for the hackers, just that one little thing going through. Of course, then you get your Comcast, I think for a while didn't even have that ability, right? It's always tough when you have a vendor, right? They don't have it available to you. And you're like, well, now I know where the hackers are going, but turn it on anywhere you can. I think it's a really great tip.
So we talk with a lot of people in maybe sometimes early stage of a business growth or startup, sort of that mentality. And it's definitely changed a lot over the years. But I'm curious your opinion about when you have limited resources as a business, and even when you think about month one, month six versus month 12, like what do you think about when you're weighing the cost of any type of cybersecurity measures for protection? Like, how do you approach that? How do you decide when to put money or how much or what to choose? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, obviously I'm very biased because I produce
Mhm.
software that does things automatically, right? So that's been pretty nice. For people that are starting out, I normally see where they try to bring in some very expensive tools. And what's interesting is that the use cases those tools cover aren't necessarily helpful to them, right? It reminds me of whenever I get an email and they're trying to sell me some big HR platform and I got like 15 people. I'm not going to need that ever, in the next 2 fiscal years, probably. And
Yeah.
so it just reminds me a lot of these really fancy tools have capabilities that will require multiple full time people just to make work properly. And so automation and having that low touch kind of thing, I always tell people, of course, in a sales pitch, it aligns with me. If it didn't align with my sales pitch, I probably wouldn't ask, right? But I would say, well, how many people do you have to manage this thing you want to buy? And if the answer is none, or my grandson or my uncle or whatever, then I'm kind of like, okay, well, then maybe not because it says it needs 3 people to manage this. So let's maybe put that money elsewhere, even if it's not the biggest and best out there, right? And that seems to help a lot of people in that scoping, because cybersecurity is a very human centric industry. It's very human centric. It wasn't always that way. In the last 10, 15 years, it has become. And people like me are trying to change that. Really, the bulk of the spend is on people, not on software.
That's interesting. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about automation and that. Before we shift there, I noticed with some of the more basic platforms that could be for everyday users or businesses, it seems like their method is add on a tool because you're so scared you don't know if you should or not. Any thoughts on that? Like, I find it to be very long term. I think it devalues the trust of the user, and it seems like it's very inauthentic at times. Is that how do you think more larger platforms work, or is that mostly the single user kind of approach for that?
No, that's really interesting. When I was starting my company, of course, I was coming out as like this principal engineer type person, right? Marketing for me was something that a lot of engineers are not a big fan of, right? A lot of people are like, great, show me what's behind the curtain, Mr. Wizard. And
Yeah.
so there are some people that believe that marketing drives cybersecurity, not product, not cybersecurity, not capability to the point where some investors saw it as a negative, where I was like, I'm going to build this, I'm going to get it working. And some investors and some CEOs were just like, that guy is not doing what he's supposed to do. He should be out there selling it and then make it again one day. That's not how I operate. So I agree. And I think a lot of marketers play on that, right? The fear of losing your job, the fear of maybe missing something. And it's all very mysterious. I think all 3 of us can probably read a contract a lot better. When I first started, that fear is what drove some probably unnecessary, very fancy lawyer spend where it wasn't really needed, very ridiculously long contracts. It reminds me of that, my first time doing some of those contracts and having absolutely no idea, paying someone $1,000 to assess an NDA that I looked at and realized nowadays that that was completely unnecessary spend. And I was actually spending off of fear, not based off of business objectives, right? So I think a lot of that is where a lot of that spend comes from, and also why cybersecurity as a unregulated business can be a little bit dangerous, because it's just so new. I feel like if it was old school, like we've had bridge inspectors, right, for like thousands of years, right? When the Romans were just kind of like, let's make sure someone looks at that bridge, and then now lawyers have the bar, right, to control a lot of what they do, and cybersecurity doesn't really have that. They can say whatever they want, do the jazz hands bit, and then people buy out of fear. And so what you're saying really resonates with basically my entire career path, trying to figure out how can I do something real in a world where sometimes I say a little bit off color. If my industry was in charge of building like X-ray machines, there'd be a lot of very sick people, and then that's kind of the way it works.
Yeah. I think for small businesses, that fear does drive a lot of things, right? And for my business and Christina's, we probably don't handle a huge degree of confidential information in what we do. And maybe I'll just speak for myself, Christina, and not include you in that, but I don't need social security numbers. There's a whole bunch of the data that I need in order to operate my business as opposed to other small businesses that are accepting credit card payments in a retail type of environment or whatever. So I'm just trying to figure out, you had both talked about like automating the cyber operations to be working in the background for you. So when does that make sense to look at something like that? And does it depend on the type of business that you're operating? And then without a large budget or a sophisticated staff that you have to hire, how do you go about implementing something like
Yeah, we saw a gap in the market with that, with everybody else doubling down on this very human centric, services driven, expensive approach. We're unique right now. 5 years from now, with all the artificial intelligence innovation, they're kind of going a different direction than I thought they would. But eventually, innovation breeds innovation, right? And eventually, yeah, I just saw like QuickBooks sent me an ad for adding AI to my accounting, which is about as dangerous as I can think of, like in terms of my business. But eventually, we'll have other companies like us doing, trying to automate the entire experience and automate the defense. So there's just no people involved. It's just automatically taking care of it. They're not there yet. We're using a different path than everyone else is doing, but eventually there'll be more of us. And I think that's gonna be a very good thing, right? Because then we can focus on building our businesses. I described to my engineers one day that we're bringing security back to the 90s when you could install your Symantec, right? Or your McAfee, you bought at Cough USA or Sugar City or whatever, right? And then you're done, it just works and you don't only get alerts.
Me when I owned my software.
And yeah, and then I realized that CTO, brilliant, savant, all of my engineers are very good. And I realized that none of them were buying software in the 90s, right? That, the analogy and the joke and the experience didn't actually play out, right? That's really what we're doing. And I think we're in that trough right now where it's kind of very complicated, and we are returning to that. But I will say, Deb, to your point, we actually had a customer that still had all of their old papers. They never completely trusted the computer system. It was an orthodontist, and they were hit with ransomware. And the guy was near the end of his career, and he was just like, I'm not even going to buy new computers. I'm just going to go back to what I've been doing forever. And he never paid the ransom. The hackers just kind of went away. I'm not even sure if his email ever got working again. But you flip that in the middle, it was small business is where we're all most dependent on the working IT, even if it's like QuickBooks Online and HR Online software and everything else you have marketing, like
Mhm.
Creative Cloud with, Adobe and everything. And it just seems like those companies are very dependent and very, we'll say a little bit fragile because of that dependency. But then it's funny, you look at the very large businesses like the Fortune 500, like PNC Bank or Bank of America or something like that. You realize that the hackers have a hard time in those places too, because they get in and it's almost like being like a first day employee or first week employee and you have no handbook. No one told you where the bathroom was. You're not sure what's going on and you're not even sure where to get coffee, and that's kind of what happens to the hackers too, is they get in there and they're these sprawling kind of enterprises, right? And they want their ransom, right? So they'll go until they hope it's far enough. I always call it right sizing, and then they right size the attack because they try to get everything. It's like a new employee trying to
Yeah.
figure out where every single person sits in the company across 3 continents. And they just can't get that far either, and then they get lost and then end up pulling the trigger on their attack. It just so reminds me of being like a new employee in a big business, having been there or in government where you're lost and you're trying to find your way. Only for them, it's for criminal purposes. And for an employee, of course, it's just like, how do I do my job? It's so many parallels I see.
Wow, these analogies are really like
Yeah.
crystallizing this for me. This is
Yeah.
good. So
Very good.
I'm a little curious about privacy pitfalls, perhaps for businesses. Do you see common things that people miss or businesses miss, or maybe they think I'm too small to worry about this kind of stuff? Like anything for privacy pitfalls or regulations they should know about, things like that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When in terms of the privacy pitfalls, it seems like during and after COVID, a lot of our companies, right, like we're scattered across the United States right now. And I noticed that what used to be a very geographically centered kind of way of doing business became a lot more national. And we're ending up with this smorgasbord of basically privacy laws. Like we have a customer in California, and then we have one in New York, and then we have one in Texas. And those laws are some are very heavy hitting and some are not, right? In terms of what's required for different
Right.
industries and also the enforcement vehicles, right? And so are they really going to go after me kind of thing? And so it seems we have to almost default to the most stringent and it becomes like the national standard. A little bit, I read how a lot of cars do comply with California's rules simply because it was so expensive from a sales perspective to have like a Wisconsin build versus a Michigan build versus a California
Mm.
build, right? And it's kind of driven some of our work internally to be prepared for the most stringent privacy regulations, even if not everybody really has to have that or GDPR for that matter, right? So that's what I see a lot of, but I also see, just to back that up, I see where because everyone has adopted all of these cloud technologies, like I keep using QuickBooks because it's like tax season and that's what I've been burying my head in. But the data isn't like I don't have a QuickBooks server anymore in my office, right? It's online. And the hackers have really adopted a technique where they go ahead and they'll go after all of your passwords. And then when you're logged into like your maybe ADP payroll, right? And you don't have to put your password in a million times, right? It like kind of just keeps doing its thing. But what's happening is there's like a key that in this case, ADP and my computer agree on in my web browser. And we say, tell you what, let's just use this key anymore and not bother the people anymore, right? And then the hackers learn that if they steal that key, they call it a token, then they can keep on going back and forth as if they're you. So it's like this new form of like identity theft. And so they're getting access to that to be able to automatically, they're doing everything automatically now. And then they'll,
What did you say that was called? Did you say?
well, it's called session hijacking or set,
Okay.
but
Gotcha.
really it's this token called an OAuth token for people like me. It won't add to your day at all. And then what happens is they'll grab that and then basically it goes password, then maybe your two factor, then this token, this key, right? And once they steal that, then they can keep on just going as if they're you without involving you because it's almost like someone stealing your key to your house at that point, right? And then they can just pretend they're you and they'll access all your cloud data. And it seems like that's the first thing they do is grab all the possible tokens and then they figure out, okay, which ones are important to me. ADP, Intuit payroll, whatever, very important, right? Maybe that login to like the solitaire game or Mahjong is maybe not as important, but it's faster to steal it now and worry about that later, right? That's what they're doing now to get access to all the privacy data. And it's pretty scary how computer scientists working for the bad guys are just automating all of this and making it very efficient where milliseconds matter.
It's very scary. So,
Yeah. Just trying to keep up, right, with it and always be diligent. And it's hard when you're just going about your everyday tasks to continuously being mindful of those types of things. And of course, from a marketing perspective, yeah, the directors of marketing out there are utilizing data on a daily basis to determine who we're going to send what emails to and all that sort of stuff. So there's data that we're accumulating from that standpoint. And to the data privacy side of it, how does one, especially in a smaller company, balance all of
It seems like using the cloud services and the data like Office 365 or Google for Work really takes the load off of the individual user who wants to. Maybe you have someone who is very technical, but not very business savvy, and they know you and they're going to set up everything with you. And then you're stuck with this very complicated situation where you're managing your own stuff and this isn't a hobby for you. You're trying to do business, right? So I totally get that. We actually had a knowledge base. To your point, our knowledge base used to be login with password only. And then we realized what happened was that prospects kept losing their password and trying to log in to see the sales material essentially to assess the product. Our competitors always seemed to have the password. They had no problem logging in at all, right? But so it was hurting the prospects from accessing, but not the competitors, right? And not the hackers. And so might be the same people, but regardless in my industry, right? So we realized that they reminded me a little bit of again, like a deep cut was the service merchandise where you had to go out and actually tell them what you wanted, right? And I was talking to a buyer back when I was a factory rep for a technology company, a retail technology company. And they were telling me how they're not sure that it's going to work because they were seeing that the shrink levels, the theft of having the product out there so people could steal was actually costing them less money than service merchandise where they couldn't actually get the product. They were making the decision to chase more, to let them steal it. And they're making more money that way anyway. It doesn't make sense, but they're making more money. And it reminded me a little bit of that kind of scenario. And so I made our knowledge base and all of our sales subscriptions and technology, all of our marketing, all our content, thought leadership. I just put it all out there. I was like, you know what? Our only choice is to build in the open because I'm not busy. We don't have people trying to steal other people's data. For me, it was a matter of saying building in transparency with all of our marketing out there, just building in the open was more valuable and more profitable for us because it was really the only way. I mean, the competitors already had everything constantly, however they were getting it. That worked out. I think it worked out well for us. A lot of people have respected that and felt they're more part of the process, no matter if it's like a marketing play or a sales play or technology play. I think they feel empowered with having that level of transparency with us.
no, that makes a lot of sense. I think I'm going to jump to your last question here. Basically, trends in cyber operations for in automation as it relates to it. So, this is obviously the sweet spot for you. What are your thoughts? Like, you hinted on some AI things and some competitive things. Like, where do you think that automation component in cyber is going?
Right. It's interesting to me that the biggest innovators in AI and in art automation really is synonymous with AI right now, right? But the biggest innovators always seem to be the criminals. It's like the risque topics,
Mhm.
right? You read in history, like the criminals were the first ones to adopt it or to weaponize or to monetize. I read somewhere that like what the VHS kicked off, like some market studies for the VHS only kicked off because the adult film industry really adopted to it. And I was just like, that's okay. I was too young for that, but okay. I'm only 40, but they're weaponizing it very effectively. They're starting to use what we call AI normally. Of course, yeah, when I say consumers, the chat
Mhm.
GPTs of the world and that kind of stuff can impersonate personalities and people very well. It's not really good at doing computer coding, despite all the fanfare. I'm not impressed, but they're really good at like saying, hey, I want to impersonate the CMO of my company to get them to give me their creative cloud licenses or whatever they're doing. Right.
Right.
So that's where the hackers really focus, what consumers call AI. And there's other stuff in the background for automatically mutating their attacks. And also the most boring and unsexy thing is they call it robotic process automation, which think of like the automotive, like manufacturing plants have those robots that know to put the
Right.
ore in and whatever. Totally does not make a mathematician excited, right? They're not like, oh, this is like new AI because it's just a robot doing the same thing it's been for 20 years, right? And
Repetitive.
that's what robotic process automation is. And the hackers learned they can use that to say, oh, look, it's this kind of company. Oh, they have this kind of software. Go
Mhm.
ahead and grab this. Now take this, do this, which from a computer science perspective is not that cool, but it's highly
Yeah.
effective. Just like a robot putting doors on cars in the factory all day, 24/7. So that's where we see the hackers going. It took us around 6 months to unlearn assumptions and to rethink how we approach our own company. Change is hard for people, right? When they're locked into a career path. And sometimes it's great when the new employee comes in, and sometimes they learn real quick. There's about a dozen reasons why we do this dumb thing. And so we realized the rest of the folks chasing AI were chasing it in a way that was almost constrained by their imagination in terms of what they were doing. It was still driven by this, okay, we have like 1,000 people all looking at alerts, like it's Willy Wonka with that factory where they were ripping open looking for the golden tickets, right? But if we can give them some robot arms, they can rip open tickets faster, but more hours, right? Instead of rethinking, okay, why do we have 1,000 people here ripping open boxes? A lot of the stuff I
Right.
see coming down now is constrained by their imagination and their experience in their industry and their career path around that. How can we rip open boxes faster? We took a step back and honestly said, what happens if we don't need boxes or
Mhm.
people or ripping open? And that led us on a little bit of a spiritual journey. It helped, honestly, having our innovation was done during COVID where I did not have normal offices available to me. So we actually rented an indoor sports arena. And I think removing everyone from that
Mhm.
familiarity helped us to innovate because it was just so uncomfortable in so many ways, like trying things, experiments out in locker rooms that were empty because, of course, the indoor sports arena wasn't open. But that really helped. And that's really helped us to find an automation technique that is not chasing the same level of low imagination, but actually we ended up using genetic algorithms like the protein folding stuff pharmacies use to make drugs. And that totally different, not GPT. And that worked very well for us. We were able to automate the entire, basically beat the hackers at their own game. And that worked very
Wow.
well for us.
Wow. That's really cool, Dennis. I know we're wrapping up. We're pretty much out of time, but I thank you because you really have spelled out. I knew a little bit, to be honest, about sort of what we were talking about today, but I really get the fact that by rethinking it, which you need to force that creative mindset, that you really come up with something that is much more equipped to go the distance and evolve and fight these like nonstop things. So I really appreciate you sharing it and breaking it down for us. So
Absolutely. Thank you. I was able to answer some questions and provide some good analogies.
yeah. So yeah, Deb, any quick comments or questions before we wrap up?
This has broken the whole cyber thing down into little tidbits that
Mhm.
we can digest and take back with us and really think things through. So I appreciate your expertise coming in and helping us figure out what's going to work best from a small business perspective and medium sized business perspective. And to know that there are people out there that are looking for forward thinking and not just trying to constrain their thought processes like you. So appreciate the opportunity to get to know you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great to meet you both.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for listening in and checking in. We hope you found today's episode helpful. Thanks to Dennis for joining us. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Spotify so you will never miss an update on Ready Set Action. Until next time.